She was abandoned by her husband and family, but no one could have imagined what happened next. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Claire stared blankly at the eviction notice, her hands trembling as she tried to hold back tears. She sat alone in the empty living room that once echoed with her children's laughter, now silent and suffocating. Derek, her husband of 15 years, had left her months ago, abandoning her for a younger woman. He had been distant for years, but Claire never imagined he would completely discard her, leaving her with nothing but debts and shattered dreams. Even worse, her family had turned their backs on her, dismissing her as a failure for marrying into a wealthier, manipulative family. Her 2 children, lured by the comforts Derek now promised with his new life, had chosen to stay with him, leaving Claire utterly alone. She had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. As she packed the last of her belongings into worn-out boxes, her hands brushed against something in the back of a dusty drawer. It was an old, yellowed envelope, sealed and addressed to her in shaky handwriting. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the signature on the front. Her grandfather's. He had passed away years ago, forgotten by the family, a reclusive man who had spent his final years in an old, decrepit farmhouse far from the family's luxurious city life. With shaking hands, Claire opened the letter. Her grandfather had been eccentric, distant even, but kind to her in the rare times they had met. As her eyes skimmed over the faded ink, her heart raced. To my dearest Claire, if you're reading this, it means I've passed on and my time here has ended. I always knew you were different from the rest of the family. I saw in you the kindness, resilience, and strength they never appreciated. I've left you something that belonged to me and now belongs to you. It's waiting for you where we last shared a cup of tea. It's time you knew the truth. Claire blinked in surprise. Her last memory of her grandfather was a visit to his old farmhouse when she was in her early 20s. They had shared tea in his small kitchen, surrounded by the musty scent of old books and the creaking sounds of the countryside. What could he have possibly left her? The man had been known to live in near poverty, his wealth long diminished by bad investments and isolation. But the curiosity was too great to ignore. Claire needed answers. Perhaps it was a small memento, something to remind her of the few moments of peace she had shared with him. Besides, she had nothing left to lose. Claire packed what little she had left into her car and drove to the rural town where her grandfather had lived out his final days. As the landscape shifted from urban sprawl to rolling hills and fields, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The noise of the city faded behind her, replaced by the quiet rustling of the wind through the trees. The old farmhouse came into view, standing alone at the edge of a sprawling, overgrown field. It was just as she remembered it, weathered with paint peeling from the walls and the roof sagging under the weight of time. The windows were clouded with dust, and the once tidy garden had been overtaken by weeds. She parked the car and stepped out, the scent of damp earth filling her lungs as she approached the house. Memories of her childhood visits flooded her mind, though they were few and far between. Her family had always treated her grandfather like an outsider, a man who had made too many mistakes and paid for them with a life of solitude. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the house was frozen in time. Dust clung to every surface, and the furniture, though old and worn, was arranged just as it had been during her last visit. The musty smell of the place was oddly comforting. She wandered through the rooms, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The kitchen, with its small wooden table and mismatched chairs, looked exactly the same. This was where they had shared that final cup of tea, and where her grandfather had told her stories about the old days. His words had always been cryptic, filled with hints of a life he never fully explained. Claire's gaze fell on the corner of the room, where a small, intricately carved wooden box sat on a shelf. It hadn't been there before. Her heart quickened as she approached it, her fingers brushing over the delicate carvings. The lid lifted with ease, revealing a set of old keys and a folded map. The map was yellowed with age, the edges frayed and brittle. It depicted a piece of land she didn't recognize, marked with a small X, at the far end of what seemed to be her grandfather's property. Claire's breath caught as she read the inscription at the bottom of the map, written in the same handwriting as the letter. What is buried is not always lost. The truth lies beneath the earth, waiting to be uncovered. Her pulse quickened. What had her grandfather hidden? What truth was he referring to? She pocketed the keys and the map, determination settling in her chest. She needed to know what her grandfather had left for her. With the sun setting low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, Claire grabbed a flashlight from a drawer and headed out to the field behind the house. The field was overgrown, the tall grass brushing against her legs as she made her way toward the spot marked on the map. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The farmhouse grew smaller behind her as she reached the far end of the property, where a dilapidated shed stood hidden among the trees. The old keys jingled in her hand as she approached the shed. Its roof had partially caved in, and the wood was rotting from years of neglect. Claire's heart raced as she found the rusted lock on the shed door. The key fit perfectly, and with a rusty creak, the door swung open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. Old tools and forgotten relics were scattered across the floor, but it was the large metal chest in the corner that drew her attention. Claire approached it cautiously, using the second key from the box to unlock it. The chest groaned open, revealing stacks of old documents, envelopes, and a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. At the top of the pile was a sealed envelope, addressed to her in the same familiar handwriting. With trembling hands, Claire opened the envelope. The letter inside was brief, but its message was clear. Claire, by now you've found the truth. Your inheritance isn't just this land. It's a stake in something far more valuable, something that the rest of the family never wanted you to know about. The documents in this chest will explain everything. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone has your best interests at heart. Her breath hitched as she began to sift through the documents. Property deeds, company shares, and financial statements piled up in her hands, all tied to businesses she had never heard of. One name stood out among them all: Henderson and Company, a massive corporation that had been in the headlines for years due to its shady business practices and ruthless takeovers. Claire's mind raced. Henderson and Company was a powerhouse in the corporate world, known for swallowing up smaller companies and dismantling them for profit. Her family, especially Derek, had ties to the company, and she had always assumed it was just a coincidence. But now it was clear. Her grandfather had been involved with Henderson for years, holding a controlling stake in the company that had the potential to change everything. The implications were staggering. Her grandfather had left her not just land, but power. Power that her family had been trying to keep hidden from her all along. Claire's thoughts were a whirlwind as she drove back into town. She couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that now hung over her like a dark cloud. Derek, her family, everyone she had trusted had been part of a larger conspiracy to keep her in the dark about her inheritance. And now, with her grandfather gone, they were making their move to take everything from her. She pulled over at a quiet cafe, her hands shaking as she ordered a coffee and sat down at a corner table. The documents from the chest were spread out before her, the weight of the truth sinking in. Her grandfather had seen through her family's greed and manipulation, leaving her a lifeline that could save her from the ruin they had tried to orchestrate. But what was she supposed to do now? Confront Derek? Call her family? The thought of facing them, of exposing their lies, filled her with dread. She wasn't prepared for a legal battle, and she certainly wasn't ready to go up against Charles Henderson, a man known for crushing anyone who stood in his way. As she mulled over her next move, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Derek. Derek, heard you're staying at your grandfather's old place. Thought you might need someone to talk to. Let me know if you want to meet up. Claire stared at the screen, her hands trembling with rage. How dare he act concerned after everything he had done? He had lied to her, taken their children, and left her with nothing. And now, it seemed, he was part of the plan to steal her inheritance. She took a deep breath and replied, keeping her tone neutral. Claire, thanks for reaching out. I'm fine. Just found some of my grandfather's old papers. Maybe you can help me go through them. There was a pause before his reply. Derek, I'll swing by later. Let's talk. Claire set her phone down, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what Derek knew, but it was clear he had an agenda. She would play along for now, but she had no intention of trusting him. Not after everything she had uncovered. That night, as the wind howled outside the old farmhouse, Claire sat in the living room, poring over the documents. The more she read, the more she realized the magnitude of what her grandfather had left her. His shares in Henderson and Company were substantial enough to give her a controlling interest in the company, and with that power came the potential to change everything. But it also made her a target. As she delved deeper into the papers, she found letters between her grandfather and Charles Henderson, outlining their business dealings. It seemed her grandfather had been a key player in the company's rise to power, but something had shifted in their relationship. The later letters were tense, filled with veiled threats and warnings about staying in line and finishing what we started. It was clear now. Her grandfather had been planning his exit from Henderson and Company, but he had been forced to keep his plans secret. And in his final act, he had left everything to Claire, hoping she would be able to carry out his wishes. The next morning, Claire awoke to the sound of a car pulling up outside the farmhouse. Her heart raced as she peered through the curtains and saw Derek stepping out of his sleek black sedan. He looked as polished as ever. His tailored suit and confident stride a stark contrast to the disheveled state she found herself in. Claire steeled herself as she opened the door, forcing a smile as Derek approached. "Hey," he said, his voice smooth and casual. "It's been a while." "Yeah," Claire replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. "It has." Derek glanced around the farmhouse, his eyes lingering on the faded furniture and dust-covered shelves. "I see you've been keeping busy," he said with a smirk. "This place could use some work." Claire didn't respond. Instead, she led him into the kitchen, where she had laid out some of the less important documents on the table. "I've been going through some of my grandfather's papers," she said, gesturing to the stacks of old letters and property deeds. "There's a lot to sort through." Derek's eyes flickered with interest as he sat down at the table, picking up one of the papers and skimming it. "Yeah, anything worth mentioning?" Claire watched him carefully, noting the way his expression shifted as he pretended to be disinterested. She knew he was fishing for information, but she wasn't about to give him what he wanted. "Not much," she said with a shrug. "Just some old stocks and property deeds. Nothing that would interest you." Derek's smile tightened, and Claire could see the gears turning in his head. He was calculating, always thinking 2 steps ahead. She had no doubt he was already planning his next move. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "if you need any help going through all this, just let me know. I'd hate to see you get overwhelmed." Claire forced a smile. "Thanks. I'll keep that in mind." Later that night, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that Derek was playing a dangerous game. She knew he wasn't being sincere, and the fact that he had shown up so quickly after she mentioned the documents only confirmed her suspicions. She needed help, someone she could trust to guide her through this mess. That's when she thought of Mia, an old college friend who had become an investigative journalist. If anyone could help her uncover the truth about Henderson and Company and her family's conspiracy, it was Mia. Claire dialed Mia's number, her hands shaking as she waited for her friend to pick up. "Claire. Wow, it's been ages." Mia's voice was bright and familiar, a welcome comfort in the chaos. "Mia, I need your help," Claire said, her voice barely steady. "It's a long story, but I'm in serious trouble." Mia's tone shifted immediately. "What's going on?" Claire quickly explained everything. Her grandfather's hidden inheritance, the documents she had found, and her suspicions about Derek and her family's involvement with Henderson. Mia listened intently, asking sharp questions when necessary. "This sounds huge, Claire," Mia said when Claire had finished. "If Henderson is involved, you're dealing with some serious players. But I think I can help. We need to get those documents into the right hands before your family can act." Claire sighed in relief. "Thank you, Mia. I don't know what I'd do without you." "Don't thank me yet," Mia replied. "We've got a lot of work to do." Over the next few days, Claire and Mia worked together to piece everything together. Mia began digging into Henderson's business dealings, uncovering a web of corruption and shady takeovers that spanned decades. It seemed that every company Henderson touched eventually fell apart, with Henderson and his closest allies profiting while everyone else was left in ruins. Mia's research revealed that Henderson had been systematically acquiring shares in various companies through a network of shell corporations, all while maintaining a veneer of respectability. But her grandfather had been different. He had seen through Henderson's schemes and had begun distancing himself from the company before his death. That was when Claire's family had stepped in, conspiring with Henderson to take control of the assets her grandfather had left behind. The documents Claire had found were the key to exposing everything. The time had come to confront her family and Henderson. With Mia's help, Claire had arranged for an exclusive interview with a prominent news outlet. The story would expose everything: the conspiracy, the corruption, and the truth behind her grandfather's inheritance. On the night of the interview, Claire sat nervously in the studio, her heart pounding as the cameras rolled. The interviewer, a sharp-eyed woman named Anne, began with a straightforward question. "Claire, you've uncovered some serious allegations about your family and a powerful businessman, Charles Henderson. Can you explain what you've found?" Claire took a deep breath and launched into the story. She spoke about her grandfather's hidden will, the conspiracy her family had orchestrated, and Henderson's role in trying to take control of the company. As she spoke, she felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. The truth was finally coming out. When the interview ended, Claire felt a sense of relief, but she knew the fight wasn't over yet. That night, Claire drove to the mansion where Henderson and her family were meeting to finalize their deal. The air was thick with tension as she approached the gates. Inside, she found them gathered around a table, their faces a mix of shock and anger when they saw her. "What are you doing here?" her mother demanded. "I know everything," Claire said, her voice steady. "The will, the shares, Henderson's plan. It's all over now." Henderson smirked, his gaze cold and calculating. "You think you can stop this? You have no idea what you're up against." Claire stared him down. "Maybe. But I'm not going to let you win." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled in. Her family shifted uncomfortably, realizing that their plan had been exposed. The fallout from the interview was immediate. Investigations were launched into Henderson's business practices, and the documents Claire had provided proved crucial in uncovering the full extent of his corruption. Her family, desperate to save themselves, turned on Henderson, but it was too late. His empire crumbled, and with it, the influence he had over her family. Derek tried to negotiate a deal, offering to testify against Henderson in exchange for leniency, but his reputation was destroyed. Claire's family, once powerful and untouchable, was left in ruins. As for Claire, she reclaimed her rightful inheritance and took control of the company her grandfather had left behind. With Mia's help, she began to rebuild the business, determined to honor her grandfather's legacy by running it with honesty and integrity. Months later, Claire stood on the porch of her grandfather's farmhouse, looking out over the land that had once seemed like a burden. Now, it was a symbol of her strength and resilience. She had lost so much along the way: her family, her marriage, her sense of security, but she had gained something far more valuable: her independence. And with it, the knowledge that she could face anything the world threw at her. As the wind rustled through the trees, Claire smiled. The fight was over, but her journey was just beginning. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.